In our last class, we talked about how at the end of the day, responsible journalism, public interest journalism is a matter of constant struggle. It is rather hard to reduce the ethical concerns into a set of universal codes and principles. And we will continue that conversation today in this last or concluding session of ethics in visual journalism. And we will continue the conversation with Tanvi Mishra. Am I pronouncing it right?
Yeah, it's fine.
Thank you, Tanvi, for joining us. We really appreciate it. Ideally, I would have loved to have this conversation in person at Pathshala in our new building, but in this evolving COVID reality, I guess Zoom, StreamYard are the new space of solidarity that we are slowly becoming accustomed with. Let me introduce you with Tanvi, those of you who don't know her yet. Tanvi is a photo editor, curator, and writer. Her work revolved around the politics of representation in photography, as well as the notion of fiction in photography, something that I find very interesting. She has worked for the last 5 years with Caravan, a magazine that published out of Delhi, and she has been involved in many photography festivals, including Chobi Mala, and she has just recently become part of World Press Photography Advisory Board. Thank you. Thanks again, Tanvi, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me and inviting me for this, in the class and important lecture. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks. As I was telling during the earlier conversation in this class, we have reviewed the universal code of ethics that are available. Then we all talked about feminist concern around representation of women survivors of sexual violence, photojournalists struggle, how they struggle while documenting stories in public protest or in situations like Kashmir or in the case of Bangladesh, the military controlled Chittagong Hill Flat. So let's start with some examples from your experience, and then we can move on to the more specific issues and concerns.
Sure. So I think, yeah, this whole conversation around ethics and visual journalism has such a broad kind of spectrum, right? I mean, one is, I think, the moral compass of the individual photographer, which is a lot of debate around that has really been circulating. I think one of the primary ones of it kind of being like, who gets to tell whose story, or now actually that's turned around, and I like the new phrase of it, which is that or you tell our stories about us but without us. So it's something that we're seeing, and we're seeing change somewhat, and I think the pandemic has, I think, out of necessity, has enabled a lot of local photographers to work just because of restrictions on travel. I mean, while that being one of the debates, I think being in a media house for the last 5 years and being in a functioning newsroom, you realize there are different kind of concerns that you face as an institution, and also as an actor in the larger kind of media landscape within a place like India, which has a, well, now we're being officially kind of called as an electoral autocracy. And the government is trying to manage its media. And in fact, the media has in many ways become a wing of the government. So of course, this is, it's not in any official papers, but we all know that how that media management happens. A large part of it also being funding and the advertisements, etc. So it's kind of, it's in the Indian. I would actually want to premise this by saying that I don't think that this is the first government that is managing media, because we know this, that across the world, and Bangladesh is a fine example of how there is a lot of control, but there is also a lot of management and what we've kind of seen as manufacturing of media, of a fact. And so two examples that we saw one very blatant example that we saw in India was in 2019 in August, when the Indian government essentially revoked Article 370, which reduced the state of Kashmir from its autonomous status and essentially reduced it from a state to a union territory. This is one of the biggest sort of changes that this government brought in, and of course there would be backlash and protests. In order to curtail that, the Indian government has for long been imposing a curfew. This is 2019, so we're before the pandemic, and a huge curfew was imposed. And there was, and that was the beginning of what is now being called the longest internet shutdown anywhere in the world, which continued in various phases almost up until a year. So when you actually shut out the internet, which in today's day and age, I feel social media is a huge tool of self-representation and bringing news out. We see it also in Palestine, this time with the attack of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. In terms of visuals that were coming out, I feel that some of the most powerful visuals came out from local, some were journalists, also citizens, and Mohammed and Mona El Kurd, who are these two very young, fiery activists, were constantly recording and broadcasting. In India, the knowledge of that is very, the government has knowledge that that is possibly going to be a response, and so internet is shut down. So what do we do as sort of, when you are part of the media ecosystem, how do you respond? Also in a situation where the government doesn't let you enter. So the Kashmir, they were facing a lot of issues. And then Kashmir has a very, very robust photojournalistic community, but they were making work, but you're not able to bring the work out because then there's no internet. How do you upload to the agency service? How do you file your story? I can maybe show you a couple of stories that we ran right after the revocation, and I'm just kind of giving this background to for the viewers to kind of get a sense of the kind of control that is exercised, and then how do journalists maybe find ways around it, because I think one of the biggest methods of control is like you stop dissemination.
Yes.
So what do we do when you cannot circulate your story? For us, I think I'll get to the stories a bit later, but which stories we did. For us, we had to send a reporter inside, and he could get in, but once he was finished with his reporting, he had to send a pen drive in the hands of someone who had to fly to Delhi airport, who had to give us the story. And we really felt like we've gone back almost, 20 years where something like this was going on, to file a piece. Of course, with the piece, you have to file it as soon as possible because the story gets old, it's changing very fast. One of the big things of sort of, I would say, in a way, to impact the narrative, the government did was essentially to manufacture a different narrative. So this is a piece that we did in our media issue at the end of 2019, which was essentially outlining the Indian government and Indian media's response actually to the revocation. One was that no visuals are coming out from the ground. The visuals that are coming out from the ground are actually only through Indian TV journalism, which is essentially celebrating the move. And what do you do as when you place a visual journalist in a part of the city where a limited amount of traffic is plying? When you're only capturing that visual for say 10 seconds and you're repeatedly broadcasting that on your channel, and you're saying, oh, things are normal, And this word normal became very important for Kashmir, because essentially it was this idea of manufacturing this idea of a normalcy. So while every street was quiet and everybody was inside their homes, and there was large military presence because thousands of troops had been moved into Kashmir in the weeks prior, the Indian media essentially was, you have to tell me if you can kind of see this. This was, we had sort of done a composite of how the Indian media broadcast Kashmir. And a lot of it was very Victorious. This is a big win for the government. How do you justify this kind of language? A lot of it is with visuals. And here, you know, if you see the visuals, this is like shikaras on Dal Lake. You're showing people walking. A lot of times old footage is broadcast, or a certain section of the city, which is not indicative of the entire city at all. It is essentially around some government buildings where some traffic was flying. You broadcast that and you say there's no curfew. So photojournalists at that point have a role not just to witness the curfew, which is essentially the opposite of what's being shown, but essentially they now have this added role of sort of
dismantling what they are saying.
Yes. So it's kind of a double-edged, not double-edged, but like it's an added responsibility in a way, and so you're almost compelled to show something that's completely, you know, you're functioning in extremes now. So this was something that the Indian media did, and that's where we can kind of maybe begin this idea of manufacturing news. And I think a lot of it, the individual photojournalist has a role which is very important, but I do believe that the individual photojournalist is only one part of a larger system. Primarily the next being their immediate editor, the next being, say, even if we break it down, it's the next being is the photo editor. It's which image out of all your images does the editor choose to print. Then what is the story? Because if you have a story showing an empty street and a curfew, but the story essentially says, oh, this only happened on one day, then whatever your photo may say, your story is contextualizing something else. And then on top of that, even if you write that story, does your organization allow you to publish it? Because the government does not want certain stories to be published. So the Indian individual is kind of this much, and there are maybe many layers beyond them to get the story out. So I wanted to know if there's this kind of control that is there in Dhaka as well, and how do individual photojournalists respond? And meanwhile, I'll pull up a photojournalist's work in Kashmir.
It's very, I mean, what you're saying as manufacturing normalcy, and in the earlier class, that the last class we were talking about managed truth, and we saw these two images, one from 2013, and this was the photograph of the owner of a building that housed 5 apparel factories, and it collapsed in 2013, killing nearly more than 1,100 workers. So it ended up being an international news, and the government felt a lot of pressure. So there's, in an attempt to, as the government says, to recover their images that was apparently tarnished not by their negligence but by the death of the workers. They had this huge media event where Rapid Action Battalion, a paramilitary troop, arrested the owner of the building from Benapol, a land border area in Bangladesh. And then we see the image, and this image dominated weeks and months in mainstream media, and it was basically telling us how the government acted so quickly and arrested the owner right before the act of escape. And then there is this very recent image from last year where one of this ruling political leader from a ruling political party and a very prominent face in mainstream media, electronic media. We saw him often talking about public health, and later at the end of the day during the pandemic, we found out how deeply he was involved in health sector scams. So these two images are so similar, and when you see these images, public do not, we don't see it as truth. Rather, we see it with a lot of questions that the things that it's not telling us. It's the whole staging of an event by the ruling elite, by the law enforcement agencies, and then the photojournalists are visual journalists are invited to come to the airport. So the wanted owner or the political leader is being he's taken out of the helicopter, and all this brouhaha, and then what we don't, you don't see it as truth, because we know, you see it with a lot of suspicion, disbelief, and that's where this whole the emphasis on reality, like capturing reality, being objective, all these notions that are very closely attached to the ethics falls apart, because we know that there's something wrong. These are their speculation, because you can't really prove that this, we can't say that this didn't happen. Truly this has happened. This man was taken, was arrested by close to the land border and all of that, but we also know that there are a lot of other things happening, the political equations, the media management, and media very happily does all of that. As you said, that media is so, and it has always been so integral part of this um, ruling structure. And I think what's troubling as I was teaching this class is that the ethical concerns are, it doesn't seem like institutionally, when we are talking about it, doesn't take into account the issues of control that you are saying, the issues of, when there is I mean, setting aside how directly in recent years in India or in Bangladesh, media has managed what people should know and what people shouldn't know. But there has always been the question of corporate interest in media, because at the end of the day, the media industry is an industry which are in operation to serve the interest of the capital in some way or the other. So all of these structural questions that in the end also governs our conduct on the ground,
right,
are not included when we're talking in an institutional environment about ethics. And it's like, it ends up being a question of how a photographer should conduct his or him or her behavior, or how this idea of remaining close to truth. I was looking at the some of the code of conducts that there in WordPress photography website. Even now, the idea of remaining close to truth is so integral to all of this discussion. It's very perplexing, because I don't think some of these situations that we are describing are very specific to India or Bangladesh. This has been the reality all over the world. The question of media control is probably not, it has a very particular character in South Asia, more tyrannical than other places, probably directly, implicitly, explicitly controlling, but it is controlling everywhere.
Yeah, I think I see it as actually two different sort of streams of thought, because the one is that the photojournalist, I think for the photojournalist, the idea of constantly searching out this truth has to be this idealistic endeavor that exists. And for me, that idealistic endeavor lies in actually building your own kind of knowledge and politics around the event that you are going to photograph. And that is essentially where truth value lies, because for me, say the images that you were mentioning of the arrests, in that case, there is whether I'm unsure if photojournalists themselves can really subvert the narrative, because the stage is set, and the essentially, if you're a news photographer, this is still a document. And for me, while the government and the authorities that have set it up, they may see it as as a vindication, it's a criminal court, etc. It's really dependent upon the media institution that chooses to run that image to contextualize like how they see it, and they can actually see it as a dismantling of the media landscape. Essentially, this is what the photojournalists are essentially now made to do. This is like a press conference image almost. You're invited to photograph an arrest, and or you're actually apprehending what's going to happen, anticipating what is going to happen before it happens. And these are you can essentially, that image is very ironical because these things don't happen at times when media is around, but the viewer is not kind of sort of that critical thinker at that point, largely because of the stories that have been accompanying the images. So I still feel, and maybe it's an idealistic thought, that the photojournalist has to constantly be able to constantly try to navigate past these roadblocks that the controlling authority will set up for them. And I think someone like Masrat, who was in Kashmir, or many other photojournalists that were there, while the Indian government had imposed a lot of control and very little news was trickling out, many of the individual photojournalists were going out and just keeping the record. And that record actually came out later by the time the news cycle had kind of shifted to the next thing. So in a way, it had been the job of the government had been done. They had avoided these stories from coming out at the time because it would have really fueled the fire. But I find this documentation on Masrat's part to be very telling. These are newspapers on the day of August 5th. So while she couldn't get her image out, she photographed what the news looked like on that historic day. And this essentially is, to me, a document of history. So she did not photograph the street and the images that we also choose to run as a second image in the piece is essentially not military control, but this is control. And at the end of our piece on Kashmir, a journalist in Kashmir actually gave this quote, which I find very telling, where he says that India has used its media as an extension of its military. One annihilates us physically and the other annihilates our truth. So where does, this fourth pillar of democracy versus how it's being used, it's very evident in this quote for me. And people like Masrat, and for a journalist that was sort of chasing the story, when we bring it out later, the story has shifted. So there's a recontextualization that's needed. So I feel that the photo editor themselves actually have to be sort of the photographer also has to be a photo editor in a certain way for themselves, where they try to thread these disparate images together to try and tell that story that they saw. So maybe that's one way to kind of subvert the narrative, because I'm not sure if the single image is able to.
I think the challenge, this is a very interesting set of work, because that's where I think critical awareness of working under controlled media environment helps, because instead of capturing the obvious, trying to look for the narrative of the controlled media, it's very interesting. And I agree with you that there is there are a lot more that needs to be done when a photographer returns to the editorial table, because these two images that I shared with you earlier, we need to look at them together to see the similarities, because these are 7 years apart. Unless you see them together, you don't know. We don't really know how things are staged, and that's where the photo editor or even the editorial policy or the news editors needs to work and put them together to question that what's happening here. Why are
I think narrative is the basic tool, on both sides. The government and the authorities are trying to build a narrative, and I think photographers need to kind of not build a narrative, but essentially they have to, I would say, like collect the different points and try to actually tell the larger story. Because I don't want to say build a narrative because it sounds like constructing a story that doesn't exist, and that's not what I mean. But I think in the case of Masrat, what she does very astutely is that, say, an image like this is not, when you think of Kashmir and you think of like military, and it's not a sensational photograph, but this is Usaib Altaf, who was 16 years old, and this is a poster of him. He died. He was one of the first casualties after 5th August, and the government kept saying no one has died. There has been no deaths. There have been no protests. So essentially, when you record this, that there is a poster outside one of the largest mosques in Saura, which was the host to the major protests around that time. Essentially, this was really telling. And the date of martyrdom, which is essentially the date of his death, is written as 5th August 2019, and that's the date of the revocation. So for the viewer as well, you need to leave these clues in the image, to get them to kind of, how is there a poster on the 5th of August of a death of a young boy? What else happened on that day? So when you place this next to the image of this, where this is the Kashmir story on the 5th, that itself is a subversion of the mainstream narrative. So that's something I also wanted to just extend this a little bit to talk about a little bit about captions. It seems like it's such a tiny part of photographers. The photographers are focused more on making the image, whereas I actually find the caption to be a very, very important tool of either of subversion or giving into the narrative. And I'm just going to kind of show you these two. So during the Delhi violence, we had Danish, who was a very, very important photographer for, I say, for India in the shift, when India has seen a shift in its democratic status since 2019, when the CAA had actually been brought into force, which is an citizenship amendment law. It's an anti-Muslim law that the government brought in. That's when kind of these India started seeing a mass protests, and at the end of the protests, actually, the protests continued from December 2019 almost up until when the pandemic began. But one of the major points to break the protests were anti-Muslim riots, anti-Muslim violence, actually, that took place. I won't say riots, because riots have a component where there is equal force on both sides. And so at the end of February in Delhi, Delhi is a capital city. It's supposed to have law and order and like the maximum amount of sort of safety afforded to its people. There was a certain part of Delhi that suffered a lot of violence for about 4 days, where a majority of deaths were Muslim, and Muslim homes were burnt, mosques were burnt. People who worked in the mosques were attacked, many were killed. So Zubair, who was lying here on the floor, Danish Siddiqui actually took this image, which became kind of an emblematic image of the violence. This, for me, is one of the most telling images of where we are at in India today, because you see a Muslim man cowering on the floor. You actually see the perpetrators around him. Many can be identified as well. But this image doesn't work in the court of law for various other sort of technicalities. It doesn't qualify as evidence. So for me, it's also the questioning the notion of evidence and what that means. But there is a long caption that has been given here, and I just want to kind of premise this for the listeners, that a photographer is a player in many different kinds of institutions. And so one is the wire photographer, right? The ones who work for agencies. Danish worked for Reuters, and the agency is a peculiar place, I always feel, because you make photographs, you file to the agency, and then the agency, we can all buy from the agency as individuals and as different institutions. So I, as a part of Caravan, can buy the same image that any other mainstream media in India can also buy. And then we can use it in drastically different stories. So essentially, what happens to your image when it starts circulating? Here, the photographer has given a very long caption, essentially giving a background of the citizenship law and also what happened during the violence, and has given his name, has given his religious identity. And it says, the first line is very important, where it says, a group of men chanting pro-Hindu slogans beat Muhammad Zubair, 37, who is Muslim, during protests sparked by a new citizenship law. It's an active voice. It says they beat him. What an organizer, and so essentially this was another outtake from his filing, right? I mean,
These were the same photograph from the same series, right?
same series, same site, but some of the people had moved away, but you can see it's the same man, and essentially the caption continues from the previous series, and they're all clubbed as a series on the wire. So essentially, I'm qualifying this to say that whoever bought the image from the part of the media house would have known, has access to all this information. What they choose to run is actually this. It says, bloody clashes, a man lies injured on the road. So this is immediately, it's gone to passive voice. There is no element of somebody being attacked, but there is an element of someone being beaten. And we can then kind of begin to extend this to many situations where you actually invisibilize the perpetrator. And it's amazing that you're able to invisibilize them despite them being seen in the image. And that's the role of the caption, I think. So while I would say agency photographers are not at fault, because they try and do their best to give to the pool of images that then circulate, but the system itself is functioning in this way that any media house can buy this image and recontextualize it. And I think photographers who are working for freelance or for sort of on contract or a staff for media houses like newspapers, magazines, etc., they need to be very careful how their images are captioned, because you can change the meaning of how a reader is going to interpret this. And many people in India have been affected by the anti-Muslim sentiment that has been essentially put out by the government. So the people have started to believe that Muslims are dangerous. So when you see a caption like this, it feeds into your own prejudice. Man lies injured, but man is Muslim. You read the story alongside, and it all makes sense. So somewhere I feel the caption is a very important tool of control and of subverting the narrative. So while images together stitch a narrative, images with text stitch another kind of narrative.
It's very important, and thank you for bringing it up, because I haven't really talked about captioning and how photographers could use captioning as a tool to leave clue in moments like this. And I think that it reminds me of another example that I have used in earlier class. It's a photograph of Robert Cohen from Black Lives Matter, about this African American man throwing back a I think, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. He was basically, what happened, there are like a contrasting version of the event. According to the subject of the image, the African American man who we see. Have you seen that image? Let me see if I can pull it out.
You can pull it up. I can stop my sharing. Is it the one of the throwing of the Molotov cocktail?
Yeah.
I've seen
tear
that.
gas canister. So the subject of the photographs later said that he was throwing back the tear gas canister because he thought that there were children in the protest and it may hurt them. But the caption or the way that photographers used in the next newspaper suggested that he threw it back to the police. So that in the end he was charged with for civil disobedience and all that, and then he does. So this was a major, I think, at that moment, was a debate how photographs get selected, and the photographer said that he didn't. That was a quiet night in the Black Lives Movement in Ferguson that night, and he
Mm-hmm.
didn't think the photograph is going to be picked, but the fact that he took some photos, he thought he would send it back to the desk, and then
Mm-hmm.
the photograph became history, and it changed and impacted the life of the subject in a way that
Right.
neither neither the photographer nor the um, man who is in the photograph have thought about it. So I guess caption is very, very important part of how you create the narrative, because or how you leave clues for the reader.
Yeah. And I think as much as, because we're also, I'm just kind of reminded of another example. So I'm going to just like pull that up and sort of, just like complete this thought. Is that I would say that photographers often don't see the thing is we're constantly harping on this idea of objectivity, and it's very rare that we talk about the fact that all of us as individuals that work within the media, whatever role that we may occupy, we are also citizens, and as citizens we are political actors, and that aspect, once it is in someone's consciousness that I am affected by government propaganda, and if I'm an actor within the media, I'm affected by government propaganda or mainstream propaganda as a citizen, and I may be responsible for furthering that same thing as an actor within the media landscape. Once photographers kind of also start seeing themselves as playing these roles, it might help clarify for them the kind of work that they also want to make, because I think the idea of witness has actually just been reduced to a certain level, because sometimes it absolves people of responsibility,
Mhm.
because saying that a photographer has to be there to witness something, witnessing is one part, but I think what you want to do with your images later is really, I think, for us the biggest crisis of our time, because I think that we are not in a dearth of good, like, dearth of photographers that are out there documenting events. We are seeing it across the world, some very talented individuals. I think now it's really taking responsibility for the dissemination of your work as well, and the manner in which it happens. And sometimes, photographers also do it individually. We had actually made this sort of, this is from the Kashmir media story, and a large part of it is actually just text. But I can show you, like, some of the images here are very telling, because um, there's a screenshot here on the top right. This is a journalist that has tweeted saying, Srinagar tonight, full of colors. I can hear the azan right now in the neighborhood mosque. NSA, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval participated in Bada Khana to celebrate Eid with brave Jawans of Jammu and Kashmir Police. Now, this is essentially, you're showing, what are you showing? You're showing like a photograph taken sort of from a vantage point. I'm not sure what full of colors means, because essentially this is, light emanating from the street. And this is on August 12th, a week after the revocation. Another image that actually really stayed with me was this, where it's small, so I don't know if you can really see it, but there are two paramilitary officers, and there are two schoolgirls next to them with school bags walking away, and the paramilitary officers are walking towards us. So a photographer who took this image has written, if you have a bag, we have your back. Army men walk past school going children in Pulwama and South Kashmir. Of course, this is social media, but I actually consider social media as a tool of media now, so we can also talk about that. How do we interpret and how do we see? We can either see this as that this is security for those girls, or we can see it as something which is where we actually, Masrat who took a very similar image, was something like this. We can, an image like this is, for me, very telling in terms of this is what childhood in Kashmir is like. Wherever you go, a school kid with a backpack should not have a paramilitary officer anywhere around them. And the fact that they have to be protected, like what are they? First of all, what is this idea of protection? Who's protecting who? But what are they being protected from? And that's essentially, not touched upon. And here, actually, the caption that ran was, an Indian paramilitary personnel directs a young schoolgirl to take another route during restrictions imposed by Indian authorities, which is the fact. That is essentially a fact in what he's doing. And then how we contextualized it in the magazine, according to the piece, is that there has been an aggressive push by New Delhi to manage perceptions in the United States on India's actions in Kashmir, because this was accompanying a piece that was talking about sort of something that was happening in the US in some conferences. So it's that, caption writing is one is, I think, for photographers, immediate story, like immediate what you see. But second line always has to be, if you're not a part of story that's being published, then write about the context in which that paramilitary officer is there. Indian government pushed 100,000 new troops or whatever was the number before the revocation of Article 370 in the most militarized region already in the world. So that will help. I think photographers have the tool. I'm not sure how many are really using it to their advantage, or maybe they are, and we're not. I think to say less or to not caption is actually also a very political decision.
I think there are few things that we need to, as we need to add to this conversation on ethics in visual journalism. Firstly, and very most importantly, the question of control that is totally left out of this conversation generally. Then also the question of not just integrity of the image, but the integrity of the journalism as a profession as well, because we all know, even though we discussion around media freedom has been largely dominated by our right to free press and all of that, but these discourses somehow excludes the question of how over the last 2 decades or last decade, particularly in Bangladesh, how embedded journalists are within the regime. I mean, they are part of the, and that's also, that's also part of the reason why the media is what it is today, that it is so far from public interest journalism. It is so far from questioning what's being told. So that's also something that's, when we are talking about ethics in journalism or ethics in visual journalism, why generally, predominantly, there isn't no effort to question some of these images that we're talking about, why there aren't critical caption writing, is partly because this is where the industry is, because industry is so very deeply linked with the regime. I will give an example. I will just mention an example and I'll send you the photograph later. Couple of months ago, in Dhaka, there is this young college girl. Apparently, she committed suicide, but that's the mainstream media news. But her sister claimed that she was in a relationship with this business tycoon in Bangladesh, the managing director of Bosundhara Group, and he owns a lot of media. He directly owns a lot of some of the mainstream medias, and then the other media are his friends. So in Bangladesh, for the last 2 decades or even maybe longer, there is this unspoken or spoken rules that journalists follow, that when you are publishing a news about a rape, you tend not to mention the name of the victim or the survivor, or you don't publish the photographs. So in this particular case, a major electronic media ended up blurring the man, the managing director of the Bosundhara Group, and presented the women as this scandalous woman because she was a young woman. What was she doing in a luxury flat in a luxury in posh area? What was her income source? Why was she? What was she wearing? What she was wearing? So there is this also. I mean, the question, ethical integrity of the journalist is also very much part of this discussion. So that is not often included when we are talking about how restrained the media freedom is in this part of the world. And that's not something, and I think you started with that, the media is also managed. It's not just truth that the state or the regime or the government wants to manage. It's also media that they, for various material and tangible and intangible gains, that they manage things themselves as well. And then there are the example of the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's 75th birthday. I don't know if you have seen this. Well, I'll send you some links. And the visual representation of the celebration was something that I think in the history of psychophancy, it will be written in bold red letter. So that question, that is also part of the ethical matrix that we need to include when we're talking about freedom of press or our ethical concerns around visual representation.
It's interesting that I think both our countries will be, and our media will be competing for, the award for psychophancy for the ruling class. So it's really quite something to sort of observe. It reminds me of this piece that we'd run, and sometimes actually you can have a little fun in the newsroom also, to sort of be able to take your point across. We're always told when we were in Caravan that we're too serious, because a lot of times, humor can be tricky, but satire is actually a very powerful tool, and images have that capacity to show that, and I think there are two images that I just want to pull up. One is, you were talking about Sheikh Hasina's birthday, so we've just had Modi's birthday. And so there was a big sort of campaign that was sort of circulated across the, from the government, on sort of how he is on his birthday vaccinating, leading these large vaccination drives. India is like really doing very poorly in its vaccination program. I mean, now it's sort of picking up. It's a lot of the debate around it is that, we're a very populous country, etc. But with the extreme mismanagement of COVID, and then the sort of complete apathy on the part of the government in terms of the vaccination program, and it's in first few months where a lot of critical time was lost. The government does these like sort of spectacular events. So while Modi had a 71-meter long vaccine shaped cake on his birthday, and a lot of those photographs did circulate, for us there was this story that was actually filed, which was very interesting, that while the government gave out these numbers that were like record numbers of vaccinations completed on his birthday, a lot of sort of digging around sort of revealed that a lot of the certificates were fake, and there was coercion in the numbers. And so once they've circulated this into the public, saying that we did these many vaccinations, very few people actually check whether that propaganda, like it's propaganda. So very few people kind of like, it's kind of swallowing whatever is given to you without those critical eyes, and pieces like this help situate. So I think for us in the photo team, we had sort of, wondering, how do we show this? Should we show like a regular person getting vaccinated? I mean, for me, there is like humor in this, but there's also sort of, in a way, reducing this like figure that is constantly, his face is everywhere. His face is also on our vaccination certificates, to sort of like within the image have this element of satire, where you run an image like this with the story. And I think this is one piece, and I think the other piece actually that that I can just point to, and I think photographers have to also maybe find those ways to find their own ways. to be able to make images or a set of images that can accompany stories. This was a piece where it was a sort of a commentary piece that was looking at the idea of hero worship within a political spectrum. And we were wondering again, we're also tired of using images of Modi because he's everywhere, everyone's seen him so much. So how do you kind of reinvent that? And for us, this was the only, well, he hasn't done any press conferences since he took office. So this was this like one time where he met a select group of journalists where he, it wasn't an open conference, and he didn't speak at all. Amit Shah, um, who was near him, is the home minister, he answered. But for us, these screen grabs from the press conference were very telling. There is, how do you kind of interpret the silence? So while for me, there is an aspect of hero worship and like this constant repetition of his image, like, being fed to us. What is it of that repetition that we want to show? This absolving of responsibility, not speaking to the public, boredom, apathy. And so I think those are the ways in which we can try to maybe subvert and the photographer. And I'm actually waiting to see works from photographers that deal with media. We do a year-end media issue, which is all reported pieces, commentary, etc. There's a lot of text, but I would really like to see photographers kind of take on this mantle and look at media and look at it through images. There's so much material there, and yeah. So
yeah, I mean it's very interesting because the similarities between Modi and Sheikh Hasina government is perplexing, but at the same time, there are so much similarity between their style of governing the public and um, I think what you said, that there are also visual silences. On the one hand, you are bombarded with um, Modi or Sheikh Hasina everywhere. There is visual suffocation, and that's the challenge that photojournalists needs to take up. First, to acknowledge that this is a challenge, that there are silences, and then find their way out of that silence and the uh, loud, loud images that we are burdened with everywhere we go.
I think I just wanted to also touch upon very quickly something that you said earlier about the case of the survivor and the perpetrator, and who is shown and who is not. I think that this was a very big sort of discussion that we were also having in the newsroom when the Me Too movement sort of took off in India and in the rest of South Asia as well. That was October 2018, I think, when complaints started flooding social media. So we did an issue in November 2018 that was dedicated to this. And actually, I was one of the people. For me, it was a strange position because while I was as creative director kind of managing the sort of visual language and what photographs do we use, which was a challenging enough idea in itself. I was also one of the people that was speaking on record. So I was a subject as well in one of the stories. And so that was a very unique circumstance where I was sort of wondering. It actually was the first time where I was put in the position of the subject. So I was being written about amongst 11 other women in the story. I was also managing how this image is being, how the story will be shown in images. So it was for me personally a very important learning point of how would a survivor feel when these images come out. And I think that is where I actually somewhere realized that sometimes photography is not enough, and it's okay to admit that sometimes okay to realize that the survivor is not the person that you want to go ahead and photograph. I had, while speaking to the reporter, it was a long experience, and it required a lot of time and strength, etc. But I was not, while I had my name out there, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be photographed. And so I was like, if I can't extend this to myself, do I really want to put it on to others? And I think that was the one case where we went ahead and actually we commissioned a few illustrations for it. I just want to kind of, can you see this?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we chose to not go with images. We actually use three tools. We use text, illustration, and image within the same piece. This is Jatin Das. He's a very famous painter in India, and there were 11 women who spoke out. I was working with an illustrator to kind of demonstrate the idea of whisper networks that circulate and to bring that idea out. And I think she did a very good job in sort of projecting what kind of man, sort of his personality is also coming through in the gaze of how she. So I come from my ideas for illustrations come from images. So I can imagine a portrait of him as such, and then we sort of went to the illustrator. How we actually get the subject's voice out was actually through quotes. We did not use their images. So this is another way in which you have their voice very very loud in the story, but we don't need their image. But whose image do we actually use? We use the perpetrator's image. And of course, we couldn't send a photographer to go and photograph them. So this is from a previous shoot of his that we sort of licensed the image. But also, this isn't the selection, right? So this is for all those who are listening, who will someday also be photo editors to decide which image to run with the story. Do I, for me, I see arrogance and I see confidence and I see no remorse in this portrait. And for me to position this image within this story is I feel that this is the man that I was sort of faced with, and I felt comfortable extending my narrative to the other 11 women and the many other women in the story. So I think imagining for the photographer to sort of just think through these roles of like the subject, the photographer, the perpetrator, the survivor, and how everybody, what is the consequence of representing different people in different ways, because we are in a media ecosystem where sometimes images are not enough. So what else is a tool in your arsenal? Text definitely is there for photographers. We had illustrators as well, but yeah, so yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing. And I think I would just want to add to that, because this is a struggle everyone who are involved in media faces every time you do a story on sexual violence. And I always wonder that what role that image of a um, survivor plays in this narrative. Like, why do you need, sometimes there are plenty of illustration in Bangladeshi media which shows a black hand um, grabbing the neck of a young girl or things like that. But what does that representation, or what do we gain from that image with the story? And I think that's something that we all, I mean, and this is a very specific tendency in South Asia. I think this is not something
Yeah.
that prevalent in other parts of the other regions, that we should definitely think about what role these images of, and this tendency to have some have a image of the victim, quote unquote,
Yeah.
with the news, what role that image plays in the process of seeking justice for the survivor. Does it have any purpose? Why we are so inclined to have a portrait and a photograph of the victim? What does it do? And in Bangladesh, especially during the Rohingya refugee earlier phase of Rohingya refugee crisis in Cox's Bazar, this was again a very important issue that photographers were running after victim of sexual violence in the camp, and
Right.
collecting narratives of what happened to them. And like, why do we need these minute details, textual details and visual details? What role does it play in the larger scheme of things? And the example you shared is very interesting, and it shows that there are ways around it to subvert the narrative.
I'm actually going back to, I think something that you spoke about in your previous class was somewhere you talked about sort of doing a Google search and seeing how certain things have like previously been sort of represented. That's actually like that kind of research is a very big part of our process, I think, as news persons. And I think for photographers, that should definitely be a big part of their personal process, because how are you going to subvert something if you don't know, what already exists? I think for these pieces on sexual harassment, we actually like build these like reference boards, etc., in which we collect all the possible illustrations, images, etc., that we can find all around sexual violence. And so we actually have a folder which shows all of these images that we consider to be problematic. But it is first going through those and identifying and articulating why they are problematic, to be able to build something that is a completely different language. For me, it was very, very important that there is no cowering of the body language. There's no hiding, no shielding. That I don't even think that the survivor needs to be present there, because why should you make this comparison between the survivor and the perpetrator in the image? Because we already know that it's a story of power. So do we really need to sort of reiterate that? I also think that it's like a bit boring, it's like we have to kind of get beyond this like very surface level idea of power, and to show like smaller victim, larger perpetrator, etc.
It's also stereotypical because it's a very fixed notion of victim, as if victim is now fixed in that very moment of violence, and there's no, in the images you don't see a development, the process, how one struggle survives. Even if you don't seek legal redress, one survives and lives on. So that's, in some way, at least in Bangladesh, the media has a very fixed idea of how the victim in this story should look like.
Yeah, I think photography. I mean, I'm still kind of waiting for sort of, this. Of course, there are photographers that are doing it, but I think the overall sort of pool of images that exists around sexual violence is still exactly what you say. Like either it's the sort of the blurring of the perpetrator and the survivor, or it's sort of these portraits, which actually I see a lot in Western media as well. That it's not just in case of sexual violence, but the aestheticization of the portrait becomes enough to justify that it's the right image to use. And I'm just sort of going back to something that you'd mentioned around the Rohingya. We had actually done this story, and if viewers are interested, they can go to it and read it. We were actually talking about this very thing where photographers sort of went in and photographed people within the camps, and we were very worried that we don't repeat the same mistakes of how do we tell the story of the media. We're reporting on the media, we're not reporting on the Rohingya crisis. So we're reporting on the media how they reported on the Rohingya. And so here again, I kind of found that photography was not enough. And so somewhere, we had commissioned this illustration, and for me, this really kind of encapsulates where the are. I mean, on one hand, you're attacked by the media, and on the other hand, you have the military behind you, and it's very important to kind of have the anger of the woman as something that's very palpable. I'm bringing in these illustrations in a photo lecture because I think that these are good reference points to then take back to photography, and be able to sort of think of ways and ideas in which we kind of sort of want to show these communities that are already persecuted. So do we really want to further persecute them by way of media? So yeah, that was just something
Yes,
I was reminded.
there is also an idea of media persecution that exists. Media, so that's a very interesting way of unsettling that process. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I think we can go on because this is such an interesting and exciting idea, and you and me both are interested in it. So, in a different arrangement, we can continue this conversation, and perhaps in next Chobi Mala we can have it in with photojournalists in Dhaka
Sure.
to raise this question with them and perhaps answer some of the questions that they may have. But I thank you so much because you have shared some examples that I think will help photographers, photojournalists, visual researchers to think about think and work differently in moments where we feel that we're cornered by the government control or the industry control. And as you said, we do have, even if we are not writing as a photojournalist, we do need to do visual researches, put images together to see the pattern, the a dominant pattern in visual narrative. We need to be very much aware of the visual silences when in reality there is a saturation of images in the industry. And be very careful of the ways we write our captions, and captions are probably perhaps the closest tool we have to leave clues for viewers and readers in representing manufactured truth, managed truth, or representing situations like what happened in Kashmir last year in 2018, or things that are happening in Chittagong hill tracts, where images are presented to us by military, and how do you navigate that? So I think we have there are enough clues and tools that are shared, and thank you so much, Tanvi, for sharing them with us to start this conversation. This is definitely not.
Yeah, I have so many other ideas bursting in my mind, but I will contain myself.
Examples that are coming up with right now, but continue. Let's try to figure out how we can continue this conversation. And thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was great. This is I think that these conversations need to happen a lot more. And I think I think within visual journalism, the emphasis is often on making the image, in terms of making a better image and a good image. I think that idea itself is being deconstructed now, the politics of the bad image, etc. So I think we kind of need to move away a little bit from that. And maybe I can end on an image, which is actually maybe not, I would say, not the most, it's actually something that happened in India recently. And it's a bit disturbing, but I think it's important for photographers to know that they are very, they're actors within a larger system. And there is no other image that actually encapsulates it better than this, where there is a police officer, there is the person who is jumping on another human being is a photographer. So this is what we're this is the world we are in today. And I think and why this is happening is that in Assam, the anti-CA, sort of the Citizenship Act has made a lot of factions within society, and like there is a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment, etc., and the people that are not identified in the list are being persecuted. So this was during a evacuation of a village, and the person on the floor is a protester. He was protesting the evacuation from his home and of his community, and the photographer was there to record the event. And the photographer became an actor and actually eventually ended up, I think, killing the person. So somewhere, this is where we are at. And I think if there is any doubt that photographers are political beings and political actors within the larger narrative and agenda and propaganda, we should see this image and remind ourselves. And I think the next generation and the listeners that would be interested in the medium have a responsibility to be able to seek the truth, but also figure out what is that truth and how do we actually get it to be communicated in a manner which is not diluted. So yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Bye.